Oh, there's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. I am here to tell you about a work of creative nonfiction, memoir by an Indigenous author who was born in British Columbia, Canada. His name is Jordan Abel, and his latest work is called Nishga. It came out in 2020, and I have just read it for Indigathon in 2021, and it's one of the most impactful books I think I've ever read. So I certainly am not going to try to review it. I'm going to try to communicate some of the things I got out of it, some of the questions it animated, some of the reading practices it encourages me to explore, and the way that it called me to stop poo-pooing my intellect and instead rather, like Jordan Abel does in this absolutely incredible work, Nishga, to unite my intellect with my emotions and delve further into the things I care about. This was an absolutely incredible work. If you are interested in Indigenous politics, culture, history, anything related to indigeneity, this is a must-read. I am a white settler remedial student of Indigenous issues and Indigenous writing, and this book is a book that I will be rereading for the rest of my life. So I'm just going to tell you about it. I'm not sure if the word is collage, but this is an assembly of documents, texts, and images through which Jordan Abel, a queer Nishga poet and academic, now living in Edmonton, Alberta, I believe. And how old is he? I don't think we know. But he's not old. I think he might be 30, maybe 35. Explores his own journey as a Indigenous man who was raised by a single white mother and who was separated from his Nishga, or Nishga as he pronounces it, and I will preserve the pronunciation that's in the title, and is cut off from his father and his father's family and his Nishga culture. And it's about seeking some kind of healing or wholeness or answers to questions. And this is no Hallmark card story, so there are no easy answers here. He and the reader are left with painful questions that, as a white settler reader, I just thought he got to the heart of so many issues in a way that's going to lead me on to further exploration for my own self. I don't think this is a book that's written for white settlers, but it's a book. What do I mean by that? I think this is the kind of a book that will speak to open-minded, reconciliation-bent settlers, as well as being I'm not qualified to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, just a rich, healing book for Indigenous people. Oh my God. So, his father was a well-known Nishga artist, and his son, Jordan Abel, never met Lawrence Wilson until he was himself an adult, and they only met once, and there's not a whole bunch of details about how that meeting went, other than I don't think it went all that well. A big part of Jordan Abel's journey to getting to know the indigenous side of his identity and Nishga culture was through immersing himself in his father's art. And his father's art is in this text. It's often superimposed over text or family photos, but it's a major aspect of this work is Lawrence Wilson's art, as well as court documents about the separation between his parents and the violence that was in the lives of his parents. And he is focused on intergenerational trauma within Indigenous lives as a result of the residential school genocide. Both of Jordan Abel's grandparents were in a British Columbia residential school. And as other reading that I've done, and as anybody who knows anything about it, and I do not claim to be one of those people, other than that I'm doing my best to catch up, will tell you, when you are torn from your family and you are stuck in a residential school for 8 to 10 years with all of the violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, slave labor, poor health and eating and diet, just any number of evil colonial traumas inflicted on these kids, erasing their indigenous language, and then they're supposed to go out into the world as adults and start healthy families themselves. And so that is my naive summary of some of the issues that Jordan Abel is exploring through image, text, poetry, photograph, legal documents, and some very revealing notes scattered throughout the text about his personal experience dealing with other poets, dealing with settler Canadians, dealing with famous Indigenous people and everyday Indigenous people, and all of that just creates a textured cry of the heart that just bruised me in the most challenging way. I think I'm not going to try to say any more. I'm going to read a bit of a longer passage to you. One of the things that this book is comprised of are transcripts of talks, presentations, academic papers that he has delivered. And you're going to see, I'm going to put it on the screen as I read a section to you, how he formats it. So he's got the minutes and seconds on the left-hand side, and then what he's saying. And I'm not sure why he did that. I found it fascinating. I'm not sure what the effect was on me, and I would be interested in anybody who has read the book. Lindy, I didn't have a chance to ask you yet. Anybody to give me your thoughts. Why did he format it that way in the book? Interesting. But in this longer section, I don't think it's going to be very long to read. It's several pages of the book, but the way that it's formatted makes it longer than it actually is. He talks about his first book of poetry, what the genesis of it was. So he's going to be talking about a famous ethnographer, Marius Barbeau, who I believe, I'm not exactly sure, early 20th century perhaps, did an ethnographic study of the Nishga culture. And you're going to see that was actually a colonialist debacle. And then after that, I'm just going to try to describe what he does with that in his poetry. And his book of poetry is called The Place of Scraps. In my book, The Place of Scraps, the main narrative revolves around the role Marius Barbeau played in dismantling Nishga culture, along with many other nations in the Pacific Northwest, by the buying and often stealing of totem poles and other cultural items from struggling communities, and very often struggling community members. I make that distinction because in many cases he did make some kind of arrangement with an individual within the community, but it wasn't a community decision. In the narrative of The Place of Scraps, it also becomes clear that Barbeau essentially stole a totem pole from the community that my grandparents were born in. And there is a narrative thread in which I remember encountering this totem pole at the Royal Ontario Museum when I was a child, without knowing or understanding its significance in my life. It's actually just a few blocks from here. That, more or less, is the main narrative of the Place of Scraps. But when people have talked about why precisely I use erasure in this book, I think most people end up missing a key detail. Their suggestion that my erasing of Barbeau's words in some way replicates Barbeau's own attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples is absolutely part of it. That by removing totem poles and taking advantage of struggling communities, Barbeau was actively contributing to colonial erasures. Yes, I think this is true. But the detail that is missing, the reason why Barbeau's text is so important to this work, is also because Barbeau's writing was the first imperfect glimpse I had into Nishga culture. and that The Place of Scraps, in addition to being about Marius Barbeau and salvage anthropology, is also about what it means to be an intergenerational survivor of residential schools. It's about what those experiences can look like, and it's about having no choice but to learn about your own family history through the now debunked work of a dead white anthropologist. So the poetry is, I haven't read, he excerpts some poetry from this first collection, In Place of Scraps, and I haven't read the entire book, and I struggled with the poetry, but what he's done is manipulated the words on the page of Barbeau's work of ethnography that was focused on the hometown of his grandparents in what is now British Columbia, and eventually, by erasing most of the words, finds his own voice and expresses his own poem. And it's quite striking. It was a bit of it gave me a headache trying to follow it all, but by the end I was completely seduced by it. And this is what he's commenting on here. He also talks in another lecture about what witnessing meant to he's writing this in the immediate aftermath of the Truth and Reconciliation report, which came out just before maybe during the writing of this book. And he gives a couple definitions of what witnessing means, and I want to focus on and read a shorter passage about witnessing, which again just shows the open-hearted curiosity of this man, where he's stretching himself to try to heal himself and his community. And I just found this in a really important section, so here it is. The next definition of witnessing, which comes from Samantha Knox's essay, Being a Witness, The Importance of Protecting Indigenous Women's Stories, is more careful to unpack the nuances of witnessing. Too often, we think that the act of listening is equal to the act of witnessing. Listening is passive. We can listen while making to-do lists in our heads, while thinking of what we are going to have for dinner, or what we are going to say next. When we witness a story, we are not only present physically, but emotionally and spiritually to hold this story in our hearts. When someone tells us their story, that story becomes a part of us. When you witness someone's story, you are carrying a part of that person with you now. You have entered a very specific and powerful relationship that exists between the storyteller and the witness. Witnessing, then, demands our full attention, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and ultimately connects the witness to the storyteller in a profound way. Although the above definitions of witnessing capture part of the process, much of the act of witnessing, particularly as I've positioned it in relation to Indigenous literature, leaves many questions I'd like to continue to think through. For example, what does it look like to hold the story of Eden Robinson's novel, Monkey Beach, in our hearts? What does it look like to carry forward a part of Jeff Barnaby's film, Rhymes for Young Ghouls? What does it mean to become a living record for Louise Half's Burning in This Midnight Dream? If Lisa Bird Wilson's The Red Files is a gift of testimony, what gifts might I give in return? What shapes do those gifts take? I ask these questions because I think they are important, and because I do not know yet what those answers might be. Well, that part of this book just got all the way inside of me, because he's listing books, one of which is an example of a book, Eden Robinson's novel, Monkey Beach, which I tried to read twice and couldn't finish, and I just didn't connect with it with the aesthetics that as a settler white Canadian that I have and which I bring to all literature that I read. And it's always bugged me because it's such a popular book and so many settler readers love it, and she's a much beloved figure on the Canadian literary scene, and I just couldn't get into it. This passage raises different questions for me as a white settler Canadian, and I think I'm still going to hang on to my right not to finish a book that I'm not enjoying, but he is also inviting me, all of us, to consider what witnessing is, and might that be different than other reading practices that we bring to other kinds of texts. That is something that I'm going to be chewing on, and that is one of the gifts this book has given to me. This was an indescribably painful, joyous reading experience for me. I am so grateful that my friend Lindy recommended it. I'm so grateful this book exists in the world, and I want to pass that gift on to you. Thanks for watching.